They say the galaxy forgets the names of mortals, that across the tide of centuries, the faces of kings and the dust of empires are swallowed by the dark between the stars. But there are some names that do not fade, some souls whose ambition burns so violently that not even the void can erase them. Belakor was once a man like any other, flesh and blood, bones that would one day break, a mind that should have been swallowed by the tide of mortality. And yet, here we speak of him, 10,000 years or more after his first breath, for his dream was a thing so terrible, so vast, that it changed the destiny of the stars themselves. It began in the primordial age, before the Imperium, before even the first Emperor's plans were a whisper, a time when the warp was young and raw, when gods of chaos stirred in their swelling power, feeding on the emotions of mortals like predators scenting blood. The galaxy was a cauldron of rising civilizations, countless human and Xenos realms clawing at dominance. Somewhere in that ancient darkness, there was a world, its name now scoured from all records, ruled by war and ruled by him. Belakor was not born into greatness. He seized it. He rose from the dust in the gutter, blade in hand, eyes fixed on the horizon like it owed him something. They say he never accepted the sky as a ceiling. It was merely a veil, and he meant to tear it down. He conquered city after city, each victory a stone in the pyramid of his own legend. But warlords are not rare in the galaxy. There was something else about him, something that made even the gods pause in their eternal feuds and watch. His ambition was pure in the most dangerous sense. It was not bound to the limits of mortal imagination. Belakor sought not only to rule men, but to eclipse them. He wanted an empire that spanned worlds, an army that could march from the stars themselves. And somewhere deep within his mind, an idea whispered that perhaps even mortality could be slain. That whisper was not his own. In the Immaterium, the Ruinous Powers stirred. They saw in him a mortal whose thirst for power burned without fear, without hesitation, without the comfort of morality. The gods of chaos do not court lightly, but they are ever hungry for champions, ever searching for mortals whose souls might be forged into something greater and more useful. Belakor's victories became grander, his enemies stronger, yet he triumphed every time, as if the very wind and storm bent to his will. He felt his own strength swell beyond the boundaries of what his body should hold, and in dreams, visions came, visions of thrones made from stars, of legions with eyes like suns, of his name carved into the bedrock of eternity. He did not understand at first that these visions had architects, but the bargain was coming. The world he ruled was locked in endless war. Rivals rose against him with armies vast enough to blot out the horizon. His own forces were weary, bloodied, stretched thin from years of conquest. The moment came when even his iron will could not promise victory. That night, as his campfires burned low, the sky tore open, not with lightning or storm, but with the bleeding light of the warp, spilling to the fabric of reality like a wound that could never close. And from that wound, the gods spoke, not in words. The chaos gods have no need of single tongue. They speak in every fear, every desire, every pulse of rage and hunger in a soul. They showed him visions of what could be. He saw himself crowned in glory, his enemies broken in a sea of fire, his name etched into the minds of every living being. They promised him an empire that would never fall, power that could never be rivaled, life eternal. All they asked was him, his loyalty, his service, his soul. Some men hesitate at such moments. Belakor did not. He had long ago weighed his soul and found it worth less than the world he sought. And so, in the darkness of that war camp, before the first streak of dawn could touch the earth, Belakor accepted. It is said the ritual lasted the whole night, though time bends in the warp's embrace. His flesh burned away and reformed in shapes no mortal eyes could bear, his bones reforged in the molten fires of the Immaterium. He screamed, at least at first, but as the pain consumed him, it twisted into ecstasy, into the sheer intoxication of becoming something more than human. Wings of shadow tore free from his back. His voice thundered like storms across mountains, and his gaze could shatter the will of kings. When dawn came, it did not touch him. He was no longer of the mortal world. Belakor, first of the Demon Princes, stood crowned in the glory of his makers. The armies that once feared him now worshipped him outright. His enemies fled not from his soldiers, but from the shadow of his wings as they blotted out the sun. But beneath the triumph, beneath the intoxicating rush of immortality, something else stirred, a whisper of unease, of chains not yet felt but waiting to tighten. He had bound himself to gods who gave nothing without taking everything in return. That truth would come soon enough. And yet, in that moment, he did not see the price. He saw only the horizon, his horizon, endless and waiting to be claimed. He believed he had won. He had no idea that in accepting the crown of the gods, he had also knelt before them. The moment of ascension is often told in the voices of priests and madmen, each one drunk on the idea of godhood. They speak of light and glory, of immortality as though it were a sunrise that never fades. But the truth is darker. The truth smells of burning flesh, of blood steaming on the altar stones, of chains that cannot be seen until they are already locked tight around your soul. Belakor's transformation was no gentle rebirth. It was a conquest. His mortal form raised a nothing and rebuilt in the image of the Ruinous Powers' desire. His skin, once hardened by years of mortal battle, was remade into shadow-wreathed muscle, sinew singing with warp energy that screamed to be unleashed. His eyes, once mortal, were flooded with the sight of infinity, the infinite storms of the Immaterium, the sprawling cruelty of the gods who ruled it, the endless tapestry of mortal lives, each one a flickering candle waiting to be snuffed out. He rose from that ritual a living weapon, forged from arrogance and faithlessness. The mortals who had followed him knelt in the dirt, their faces pressed so deep into the earth that they did not dare look up. Some wept in awe, others trembled in terror. Belakor felt their devotion pour into him like wine into a goblet, sweet and intoxicating. With a thought, he could feel their fear, their loyalty, their love. All of it is to command. And yet, somewhere beneath the exhilaration, the first link in his chain was already cooling into place. The Chaos Gods had crowned him their first Demon Prince, the first mortal ever granted the full and terrible gift of their power. But chaos does not give without reason. Belakor had not been made to rule unbound. He had been made to serve. He didn't see it at first. The earliest days of his godhood were an orgy of conquest. He swept across the worlds he had once bled to claim, now unstoppable, every rival's army breaking before him like foam against black cliffs. He could tear apart a city gate with his bare hands, crush champions beneath his wings, bring entire empires to heel in a single campaign. His laughter shook the sky, but when the gods whispered, he listened. When they called, he obeyed. Orders came to him like thoughts from his own mind, subtle at first. Take this world. Slaughter that people. Guard this relic. Each task furthered the will of the Ruinous Powers, though he cloaked them in his own ambitions, believing himself still master of his destiny. And then came the first true test of his freedom. A rival warlord rose, mortal insignificant, but dangerous enough to threaten one of Belakor's newly forged realms. Belakor intended to crush him, to make an example so terrible it would be spoken of for centuries. But the gods had other plans. They whispered of another war, far from his throne, and commanded him to go there instead. He refused. It was a small rebellion, merely a delay. He thought himself too valuable for them to punish. The pain that followed was not physical. It was as though his very essence was seized and wrenched apart, like a song twisted out of tune until it became a scream. The gods spoke not in words, but in a storm of sensation, reminders of what he was, and more importantly, who owned him. When the agony ceased, He went to the war they had demanded, and he understood. He was not a king. He was a crowned slave. The title Daemon Prince was no coronation. It was a collar of gold. His victories were theirs. His armies were theirs. His immortal flesh was theirs. They had raised him to the heavens only to chain him there, a jewel in their crown, to be paraded when they pleased and hidden away when they did not. In the depths of the Immaterium, away from mortal eyes, Belakor's laughter died. He began to see the cruelty in every divine whisper, the contempt behind every gift they offered. And still he obeyed, not out of loyalty, but because he could not yet break the leash. In his darkest moments, as the warp light guttered around him, he began to dream again. But these dreams were not of conquest. They were of escape, of a day when the crown would be his, and his alone, and when the gods themselves would kneel. They called it a gift. The first Daemon Prince, the one who had been lifted above a mortal coil, robed in shadow and crowned with the favor of all four gods. But Belakor knew better. By the time the truth settled in his bones, the crown felt heavier than any helm he had worn in his mortal life, and the weight was not pride, it was servitude. The gods had bound him not with iron, not with rope or steel, but with something infinitely stronger, their will. He would feel it always, like the pressure of deep water on the skull, invisible yet undeniable. His form was eternal, his power unmatched among his kind, but every surge of strength came on a leash. And then the insult: the Chaos gods are never content with one champion. They are fickle, ever hungry, forever pitting their pawns against one another for sport. No sooner had Belakor drunk deep his ascension than others began to rise. New demon princes, new mortal warlords whose ambitions caught the gaze of the Immaterium. Some were brutes, some were zealots, some were sorcerers of a brilliance that might have impressed Belakor had he not despised them on sight. At first, he believed he would stand above them all by divine decree. Was he not the first? The template by which all others were measured? But the gods, they delighted in testing him, in raising others not only to match his station, but to surpass him in favor, in freedom, in victories granted without the chains that bound him. He watched them strut across the galaxy, leading wars of their own choosing, carving realms in their names. Some of them, lessers by any measure, were allowed to rule as they pleased, while he, Belakor, the first damned, was sent to crown them. That was when the envy began to bloom, not the petty jealousy of mortal kings, but a venom that dripped from his very essence. He despised them, every last one of these upstarts. But most of all, he despised the ones who had made him, for it was their favor that gave others the freedoms he had been denied. He began to plot, quietly at first. In the shifting realms of the warp, whispers and half-seen visions became his weapons. Rivals found themselves betrayed at the height of battle, their victories collapsing into ambushes that had Belakor's invisible fingerprints all over them. Promising champions were lured into pacts that seemed sweet, but led only to ruin. Even those he was sent to crown sometimes fell to mysterious accidents soon after. Yet every act of sabotage carried risk. The gods knew his heart. They could taste his bitterness as surely as they could taste the prayers of mortals. There were times when he overreached, and the punishments came, burning through his soul like molten lead, scouring away fragments of his will until he could do nothing but obey. Still, the hatred festered. It became a companion, a constant presence in his mind that whispered not of service, but of vengeance. There is a cruelty in watching another rise to take what should be yours, and Belakor tasted it again and again. Mortal warlords who had once been nothing more than ants to him were lifted up to command legions, to carve their names into the galaxy's bones. Demon princes barely out of their ascension strutted, as though the galaxy itself were theirs. And Belakor was sent to kneel, to anoint them, to place crowns on their heads, crowns he could never wear, The gods mocked him in this role. They made it his eternal duty, dressing in the language of honor. First to crown the chosen, the hand that bestows destiny. But there was no honor in it, only humiliation. Every coronation was a reminder of what he would never have. Every bow a knife turned in his pride. So he learned patience. If the leash could not yet be broken, then it would be lengthened, stretched by subtlety, by deception, until one day it snapped. He would bide his time, crown their favorites, watch them rise. And when the day came, he would watch them fall. And deep within the storms of the warp, in the places where even the gods' eyes drifted away, belakor began to dream again. But these dreams were colder now, sharper. They were not the bright visions of conquest that had once driven him. They were dreams of ruin, of the day when the crowns he placed upon others' heads would turn to ashes, and the chains around his own neck would be broken in the blood of gods. There are cruelties the mortal mind cannot comprehend, tortures that go beyond the rack, the blade, or the fire. For belakor, the greatest cruelty was not the loss of his freedom, nor even the chains that bound his will to the whim of his dark masters. It was a role they had crafted for him, a punishment so elegant and mocking that only the chaos gods could conceive of it. They had made him a kingmaker, forever denied a crown of his own. It began as a single task, handed down with the weight of divine command. A mortal champion had risen, favored, promising, chosen by the gods to lead their wars in the mortal realms. It was belakor who was sent to crown them, the gods' first and greatest prince, the instrument of their blessing. It was a performance cloaked in grandeur. The skies would blacken, storms of shadow and fire would herald his arrival. The chosen champion would kneel, trembling, as belakor placed the crown upon their brow. But to belakor, every coronation was a death. For in those moments, he saw his own reflection, not in the mirror of glass, but in the mirror of fate. He saw the moment of his own rise, the moment when he believed himself free, powerful, untouchable, and he knew, as no mortal champion could, how it would end. They too would be discarded when they ceased to amuse the gods. They too would be broken on the wheel of divine whim. And still he crowned them. The cycle became eternal, champion after champion. Each one heralded as a savior or destroyer of their age. Each one brought low in time. Some he despised instantly. Brutes drunk on bloodshed, zealots babbling prayers to masters who would forget them the moment they faltered. Others he almost admired, warriors of vision and cunning, whose fall would sting all the more when it came. But none escaped the doom he had foreseen for them. In the mortal realms beyond the Eye of Terror, his visits became legend, the shadow descending from the skies, the chill in the air as the crowned figure emerged from the storm. Some saw him as a herald of glory, others as a curse in winged form. Armies trembled at his approach, for they knew that where belakor walked, the gods was being woven into the fate of worlds. But in the hidden places of the warp, where his voice could not be heard by those he crowned, belakor seethed. He spat curses at the gods who forced his role upon him, who made him bow his head and kneel before mortals who had not earned his respect. He would dress the coronations in grandeur, yes, but he took a secret pleasure in watching some of these chosen falter, knowing he had sown the seeds of their undoing. He was an artist of ascension and downfall. Sometimes the downfall came quickly, a champion too arrogant to heed warning, crushed by the first great challenge. Sometimes it was slow, drawn out over centuries, as the crowned heroes' victories turned to ashes and their armies dissolved into dust. Belakor took them all as proof of a truth the gods themselves could not deny. None of their toys would last forever. And yet, in his heart, the humiliation burned, because while these champions rose and fell, he remained chained. He was eternal, yes, but not free. The gods thought it amusing to make him speak the words of their blessing, to anoint these mortals with promises they would not keep. They enjoyed watching him play the role, Knowing the bitterness it stirred in him, it was a performance of their amusement, one that he could never refuse. Over time, mortals came to call him the First Damned, the Shadow-Crowned, the Hand that Grants Thrones. And the worst part? They thought these titles honorable. They thought him the willing servant of his god's will, the chosen herald of their chosen kings. They did not see the truth, that every crown he placed was another shackle on his soul, that with every coronation his hatred for his masters grew, until it became something vast and consuming, a thing that could no longer be hidden behind the mask of a dutiful prince. And still the cycle turned. Another champion would rise. Another crown would be forged, and the gods would send Belakor to kneel before them, to crown them, to set them on a throne that should have been his. For all his plotting, for all his whispered betrayals, for all the subtle ways he tried to twist the gods' plans, the truth gnawed at him. He could not yet break free. But in the silence between wars, when the storms of the warp lulled and the voices of the gods grew faint, he would whisper to himself, as if to remind the darkness of its own fragility. A kingmaker can be a king. All it takes is the right moment. There are events so vast in their consequences that history itself bends around them. The scattering of the Primarchs was one such moment. A crime against destiny, a fracture in the Emperor's grand design that shaped the fate of humanity for the next 10,000 years. To most, it remains a mystery buried in the dark of the warp, blamed on the caprice of the Ruinous Powers. But there are whispers, dangerous whispers, that speak of a single shadow moving unseen among the gods themselves, guiding their claws as they tore the Emperor's sons to his grasp. If that whisper is true, then its name is Belakor. By this time, the First Damned had long since grown weary of his Kingmaker's curse. He still bowed when commanded, still crowned the champions the gods placed before him. But his hatred for his masters had deepened into something more refined. No longer was it a blind rage. Now it was patient, surgical. He had learned that a blade in the dark could do more damage than an army in the light. And so, when the Ruinous Powers turned their gaze upon the Emperor's great project, his 20 sons, forged not merely to lead armies but to shape an entire Imperium, Belakor saw opportunity. The Emperor was not yet the hated foe he would become in the eyes of chaos, but he was already their rival, a being of such will that even the gods took him seriously. His Primarchs were to be the keystones of his dominion, each one a living embodiment of his design, his ideals, his purpose. To break them was to wound the Imperium before it could be born. The gods were eager. They conspired to unleash the warp upon the Emperor's creation, to scatter his sons to the corners of the galaxy. But even among such divine malice, there is chaos in chaos. Plans can clash, intentions can weaken, and this is where Belakor's hand may have shaped the storm. The legends say the warp surged with unnatural violence, the gestation pods of the Primarchs torn from their vault and cast into the void. But in certain heretical accounts, there are details that stand out. The shape of a great winged shadow gliding between the roiling tides of the Immaterium, steering some pods toward worlds of slaughter and despair, others towards planets where temptation could take root. It is said that even the gods themselves were surprised at how fitting the destinations became. Was it their design, or his? Consider this. How many Primarchs found themselves in lands ruled by tyrants, in cultures ripe for corruption? How many were seeded into worlds where they would learn pride, suspicion, or rebellion? Not all of them, but enough to shape the heresy that would come. If Belakor did intervene, he did so with surgical cruelty. Perhaps he whispered to Khorne that Angron would be a finer servant if tempered in the blood arenas of Nassyria. Perhaps he suggested at sense that Magnus would bloom best on a world steeped in psychic lore. Perhaps he guided Lorgar to Kalkis, where faith could be both his strength and his downfall. Each placement a seed of future war, each one a small wound in the Emperor's dream. Why would he do it? Not for the gods' favor. By now, belakor had no illusions about their gratitude. No! He did it because chaos in the mortal realm meant distraction in the divine one. Every fracture in the Emperor's plan was another knot in the skein of fate. Another opportunity for belakor to slip his leash. The gods, if they suspected his interference, did nothing to stop him. Perhaps they believed his meddling served their ends. Perhaps they found his subtlety amusing. Or perhaps, in their arrogance, they did not see it at all. When the scattering was done, the warp fell quiet, but the damage had been done. The Emperor's sons were lost, flung to farthest reaches of the galaxy, their destinies warped by the worlds that found them. And belakor, he returned to his endless cycle, crowning champions and plotting in the shadows. But somewhere in the black storms of the Immaterium, he carried the memory of that interference like a hidden blade. The day would come when such a blade would be needed again, when a single well-placed cut could change the course of the galaxy. Until then, he waited, and the god's leash grew just a little looser. The mortal mind cannot grasp the true shape of war in the Immaterium. It is not fought with armies of flesh and steel alone, though those too have their place. In the warp, every battle is a storm of thought and emotion, every weapon and idea sharpened into a spear, every fortress a nightmare carved into permanence by will alone. And in this endless theater of shifting reality, belakor was both predator and prey. The Chaos God's realm is no unified empire. It is a continent of storms, tore apart by oceans of madness and fire. Between the domains of four lie the borderlands, ever-shifting territories where demon princes, greater demons, and other horrors carve out fiefdoms with blood and treachery. Here, belakor moved like a shadow, a whisper in the fog, never holding one place for too long, never giving his enemies time to unite against him. For centuries, he waged wars unseen by mortal eyes. He toppled lesser princes with surgical strikes, unmaking their citadels of bone and shadow, scattering their souls into the howling tides. Sometimes he struck directly, his talons and blade cutting through foes like a black storm. Other times, he never lifted a hand, allowing whispered lies to turn allies into murderers, or feeding just enough strength to an enemy's rival to topple him in his place. He was not the strongest prince in the warp. Others dwarfed him in raw, God-granted might, but none could match his cunning. Belakor fought like a spider, weaving webs across the realms of chaos, waiting for the right vibration to strike. Yet these victories were not without cost. Every gain he made in the Immaterium, every territory seized or rival destroyed, drew the attention of the gods, and when their attention came, so too did their demands. One moment he would be on the brink of seizing a fortress world in the realm of Khorne. The next he would be ripped from the field, summoned to perform his eternal humiliation, to crown some new mortal champion in the material galaxy. Worse still were the punishments. The gods did not tolerate defiance for long, and belakor's ambitions often brought him into conflict with their chosen favorites. When he overstepped, when his schemes cost him a pawn they valued, the retribution was swift and absolute. They would strip him of power mid-battle, leaving him exposed before his enemies. They would burn his essence with divine fire, unmaking him for weeks, even months, until he clawed his way back into form from the warp's abyssal depths. And yet he never stopped, for belakor knew the truth. To be still in the warp is to be devoured. A demon prince who ceases to expand, to plot, to scheme, becomes prey. His rivals would not hesitate to feast on his downfall, and so he kept moving, striking, weaving. Each war was a distraction from his chains, each victory a reminder that he still had claws sharp enough to cut. He waged political wars too, wars of influence among the demonic courts. He would appear as an ally to a greater demon of Nurgle, aiding it in subduing a rebellious plague host. only to poison victory by feeding secret gifts to sensuous servants. He whispered into the ears of Slaneshi princes, stoking their vanity until it turned to paranoia. He traded promises with Khorne's blood-maddened generals, only to betray them when their rage blinded them to his true aim. To mortals, this might seem petty, a game of shadows and whispers in a realm already lost to madness. But in the warp, power is currency and reputation is armor. Every defeated rival, every debt owed, every whisper believed could mean the difference between survival and obliteration. Still, the leash remained. No matter how far he pushed, how deep he schemed, there was always the risk, no, the certainty, that the gods would tug him back into line. And each time they did, the humiliation was salt in a wound that had never healed. But belakor was patient. War in the Warp had taught him that victory was not always about brute force. It was about endurance, about surviving long enough to see your enemies falter. And the greatest enemies of all, the ones he intended to one day see broken and bleeding, were the very beings who had made him. In the shifting darkness of the Immaterium, as battlefields rose and fell like the tides, belakor kept his eyes fixed on a single, impossible goal, a war not just against rival princes or mortal heroes, but against the gods themselves. And for that war, he would need to outlast them all. If hatred is a fire, jealousy is a smoke that clings to everything it touches. It seeps into cracks, stains the air, poisons the breath. And in belakor's immortal existence, nothing burned him more than the sight of others, mortals of all things, being granted what had been denied. For all his power, all his cunning, all his centuries of service, he remained the chained prince, the first and greatest in name, perhaps, but in truth little more than a tool. Yet he watched, helpless intervene, as champions rose from nothing to eclipse him in the eyes of the gods. Abaddon the Despoiler was one such wound. A mortal, born in the dying days of the Great Crusade, who rose from the ranks of the Lunar Wolves to become War Master of Chaos. Belakor had walked the Immaterium for millennia before Abaddon had even drawn breath, yet the gods whispered the War Master's name with reverence, fed him armies beyond counting, and gave him the freedom to wage his long war however he pleased. Freedom, that was the knife. Belakor watched as Abaddon carved his legend across the stars, the gods bending their will to his cause, tolerating his failures, even turning them into further opportunities. The first Dam knew that if he himself had failed the way Abaddon had failed, 13 times by some counts, he would have been dragged in chains before his masters and torn apart until nothing remained. But Abaddon was not the only thorn. In another realm, far removed from the stars of the Imperium, another mortal bore the title of Everchosen, Archaon, the favorite of all four gods in the mortal realms of the world that was, and its successor. Belakor's chains rattled with every mention of that name. Archaon had been crowned in glory, by Belakor's own hand, no less. And yet, unlike the first damned, he strode unbound. He commanded legions at his own whim, led wars without a leash. The gods adored him, as they had once adored Belakor, but they never chained him in the same way. Why? The question gnawed at him. Was it because he had been the first, and they feared what he might become without restraint? Was it because his ambition had burned too brightly, too quickly, and they had learned their lesson? Or was it simple malice, an eternal punishment designed not to break him, but to keep him burning forever without consuming? Jealousy in the Immaterium was not like mortal jealousy. Here it took form. It whispered in the warp, reshaped visions, twisted dreams. Belakor's envy was a living thing, a coiled serpent in his mind, hissing every time another name was praised in his place. He could see the threads of fate stretching from these so-called champions, glowing with divine favor, while his own threads were bound in knots by the god's will. And he began to act on it. Against Abaddon he was subtle. Too much interference would draw the god's wrath. So he fed the War Master's enemies scraps of knowledge, nudged events so that victories were costly, Pyrrhic things. He whispered doubt into the minds of the Baden's lieutenants, seeding treachery where loyalty should have been. Against Archaon, his hatred was more direct. In the mortal realms, the two clashed more than once, each encounter steeped in venom. Belakor's armies would descend like storms undo the Ever-Chosen's campaigns, his sorceries unraveling the delicate weaves of Archaon strategies. Yet somehow, the favored champion always emerged standing, and the gods would smile on him all the more. It was a cycle that sickened Belakor. He had given everything to his ascension, surrendered his soul to the ruinous powers, endured centuries of humiliation, and for what? To be a shadow at the edge of their courts, a servant whose greatest victories would never be his own? In the dark places of the warp, where no god's gaze lingered for long, Belakor made a vow. If he could not yet free himself, then he would see these favorites undone. He would wait for the day their golden light dimmed, for the moment when the gods turned their attention elsewhere. And when that day came, he would strike, not with the roar of an army, but with the silence of shadow, the silence before the crown all falls. The titles laid upon him. First damned Shadow Crown, Prince of Nothing. There is one that Belakor despises more than any other, Master without a throne. He has commanded armies that blotted out the horizon, shattered mortal empires in days, and broken champions the gods once loved as dearly as a child loves its toy. He has stood upon mountains of bone, the air thick with the scent of victory and burning worlds. And yet, every time, the throne he sought was denied. It is not simply that the gods refuse to grant it. No! Thrones appear before him. Opportunities arise. Worlds ripe for the taking. Rival princes weakened. Mortal realms trembling on the edge of surrender. The seat of power is there, and every time he reaches for it, the leash snaps taut. Sometimes the command is explicit. Abandon this war. Leave the realm you've claimed. March to crown some mortal who has amused the gods. Other times it is more insidious. A sudden weakening of his power at a crucial moment. His enemies gifted unnatural strength. His own generals seized by madness until the campaign collapses. The message is always the same. You are not meant to rule, Belakor. You are meant to serve. But service is not in his nature. He is a creature of ambition, forged in mortal conquest long before the gods touched his soul. And so he rebels. His rebellions take many forms. Sometimes they are grand coups, campaigns in which he marshals every demon and mortal warband at his disposal, striking deep into the territory of rival princes with the aim of claiming their seat as his own. Other times they are subtle plays, planting spies in the courts of great demons, orchestrating quiet assassinations that leave entire fiefdoms leaderless, ripe for him to step in and claim. The first time he tried hold a throne in defiance of the gods, it was in the borderlands between Sencha's crystal labyrinth and the blood-soaked plains of Khorne. A fortress unlike any other stood there, its towers of obsidian rising from a sea of screaming souls, warded by sorceries older than the Horus heresy itself. Belakor saw in it the perfect base of power, a realm at the crossroads of the gods' domains, where he could play them against each other, bargaining with one while bleeding the other. For a time it worked. His banners flew from its walls. His enemies kept at bay by a web of alliances and threats. But then the summons came. A new Ever-Chosen was to be crowned, and the gods decreed that Belakor would do it. He refused. The retribution was immediate. The skies over his fortress split open, and from the tear poured a tide of demonic legions. Not his enemies, but his fellow servants, sent by the gods themselves. They did not come to conquer. They came to dismantle. Piece by piece, stone by stone, they tore his realm apart, scattering its walls into the warp like ashes on the wind. Belakor fought like a storm-given flesh, but in the end, even he could not stand against the united will of his masters. After that, he learned If the throne could not be seized openly, it must be stolen in pieces, assembled in shadow until it was too vast to be taken from him. He began sowing discord between rival princes, creating wars where none existed, weakening both sides until he could sweep in and claim the scraps. He turned mortal warlords into puppets, their realms secretly feeding his coffers of souls and power while they believed themselves free rulers. He established hidden fortresses deep in the warp's uncharted reaches, where the gods' gaze was weaker, building up reserves of warriors and artifacts for the day he would rise without asking permission. But the gods always found out. Sometimes they laughed, stripping him of what he'd built and forcing him to watch as they gifted it to another. Sometimes they punished him with exquisite cruelty, burning his name from the minds of his followers, so they no longer knew whom they served, leaving him surrounded by armies that did not even recognize their own master. The most humiliating punishment came when they forced him to serve as a general in the army of a rival prince, leading troops for another's glory. And yet, the rebellions never stopped. Belakor's hatred had long since burned past the point of reason. It was no longer enough to dream of ruling. He wanted to see the gods themselves kneel. He imagined it sometimes, in the quiet between wars, in the drifting emptiness of the warp, how it would feel to wrap his talons around the throats of those who had chained him. He did not delude himself into thinking it would be easy. The gods are eternal, their power beyond the reckoning of even the mightiest demon. But he also knew this. Nothing is eternal in chaos except ambition. And so, he played the long game. Every failed coup was a lesson. Every lost fortress taught him where the gods' reach was weaker. Every assassination and betrayal was a test of how far he could push without their full wrath descending upon him in the mortal realms. His rebellions took on another form, sabotaging the very champions he was sent to crown. A whisper in the ear of a rival, a cursed gift disguised as a blessing, a prophecy that led them into ruin. He could not refuse the gods' command to crown them, but he could make sure their reign was shorter, bloodier, and less useful than his masters intended. Still, the leash held. No matter how many victories he stole, no matter how many rivals he unmade, the final step always eluded him. The gods had shaped his very essence to obey them, and until he found a way to unmake that shaping, he would remain a master without a throne. But Belakor is patient. He knows that thrones are not always seized in moments of glory. Sometimes they are taken in the shadows, when the rightful ruler is too weak to resist, when the court is too busy with its own blood feuds to notice. And when that moment comes, when the gods are distracted, when their chosen champions are gone or broken, Belakor will be waiting, and perhaps, when the first of their thrones is his, the others will follow. There are punishments in the mortal world. Prisons, torture chambers, executions that mortals imagine to be the height of suffering. They are nothing. A single moment of the chaos god's displeasure can make a century of mortal agony feel like a pleasant dream. Belakor knows this truth better than any other. The first damned has tested the leash more times than he can count. Sometimes with grand schemes, cool attempt against rival princes, the seizure of forbidden fortresses. Other times with subtle defiance, crowning the gods chosen in hollow ceremony, weaving curses into his blessings, quietly undermining campaigns they demanded he strengthen. Each time, he hoped to push the boundary a little further, to feel the leash slacken just enough to keep pulling. And each time, when he crossed the invisible line, the retribution fell. It never came the same way twice. Sometimes it began as a sudden stillness in the warp, the color leaching from reality until only shadow and cold remained. Then the god's presence would fall upon him. Not one, not two, but all four, their voices a storm of madness that no mortal tongue could describe. They would speak without words. They were pressing into him like the weight of a collapsing star, until every thought, every scrap of ambition was crushed beneath it. In those moments, He could not even remember why he had rebelled, only that his masters were displeased and that he would do anything to make it stop. Other times, they made the pain physical, reshaping his immortal form in ways meant to humiliate as much as harm. His wings torn away, leaving him crawling through the dust like a worm, his claws melted into stumps. His vision stolen, leaving him blind in the howling dark, while enemies closed in. And because he is a demon, these wounds did not kill him. They lingered, festering for years or decades before the gods saw fit to restore him. The most insidious punishments were those that attacked his mind. The gods know the shape of every soul they own, and Belakor's is mapped in exquisite detail. They would twist his thoughts until he could no longer tell whether an idea was his own or a command they had planted. They would conjure visions of triumph so real, he could feel the weight of a crown on his brow, only to rip them away, revealing himself kneeling at the foot of another's throne, the gods laughing in the shadows. Sometimes they would leave him there, trapped in an endless loop of false victories and fresh humiliations, centuries passing the blink of an eye, until he could no longer trust his own memories. And then there were the times they broke him entirely, when Belakor's defiance crossed into open rebellion, when he dared to seize territory they had explicitly forbidden him, or to kill a pawn they valued. They would unmake him, not kill. Death has no meaning for one such as he. They would dissolve his essence into the raw substance of the warp, scattering it to the winds of madness. He would drift there, formless, bodiless, thought itself eroding under the endless storms. In that state, he could not scheme. He could not hate. He could only endure. Days, years, centuries. It was impossible to measure. When they chose to remake him, it was never an act of mercy. They would pull him from the abyss in pieces, rebuilding him like a craftsman mocking his own work. Each step a reminder that his existence was theirs to give and take. Sometimes they would change him subtly, a lingering weakness in one wing, a phantom pain in his talons, just enough to remind him of what had been done. Even the mortal world was not safe from his punishments. The gods have 1,000 ways to harm their servants through what they value, and though Belakor is loath to admit it, there are things he values still. Armies he has cultivated over centuries, mortal rulers he has shaped into perfect tools, demon lieutenants who serve him with rare loyalty. All of these gods have struck down when they wished to teach him a lesson. They would erase his name from their minds, strip them of the will to fight for him, or simply gift them to another prince as spoils. The worst of these punishments came when the gods gave his armies to his rivals. More than once, Belakor has been forced to watch his banners bearing his mark were torn down and replaced with those of some upstart prince or mortal warlord he despised. The gods would not even pretend it was justice. They would make a spectacle, a public display in the courts of the warp, as if daring him to act. And yet, each punishment only deepened his hatred. A lesser being would have been broken long ago, reduced to a docile servant grateful for whatever scraps of favor remained. But Belakor is not lesser. Every agony, every humiliation, every long drift in the void of unmaking has been burned into him as fuel. The gods believe they are tempering his will, keeping him useful. In truth, they are hardening it, turning it into a weapon he will one day use against them. He has learned from their cruelty. The leash is strongest when pulled against. If he strikes too openly, too soon, they crush him without effort. But if he tugs lightly, if he works in the shadows, if he bleeds them slowly over centuries, they barely feel it until it is too late. That is the art he has mastered, not the art of defiance, but of survivable defiance. And still, he dreams. When he drifts in the quiet places between punishments, he imagines a reversal. The gods bound and gagged in chains of their own making, forced to serve the will of the first damned. He imagines the taste of their submission, sweeter than any mortal crown. He knows it is a fantasy, for now, but Belakor's fantasies have a way of becoming other people's nightmares. One day, he swears, The cost of defiance will not be his to pay. It will be theirs. The mortal realms tell their stories of wars as if they are finite things. Campaigns with beginnings, climaxes, and ends. In the warp, such notions are illusions. Battles bleed into each other across centuries. Grudges are waged over millennia. And a single duel can echo through 1,000 different wars. The conflict that would come to be known, at least in the whispers of those reckless enough to speak of it, as the battle for Malice was one of these timeless wars. It began, as such things often do, with a crown, not the mortal circlet belakor had placed upon so many undeserving brows, but a relic of terrible, forbidden origin, a diadem said to contain a fragment of a god's essence. Its name was lost, buried beneath the layers of lies and half-truths that surrounded it, but its purpose was simple: to grant dominion not by the god's blessing, but in defiance of it. No one knows where it was first forged. Some claimed it had been wrenched from the corpse of a nameless warp entity slain before the four had consolidated their dominion. Others whispered that it was born from the raw hunger of Malice, the so-called renegade god, the outsider whose existence the Chaos pantheon refuses to acknowledge. Whatever the truth, the gods themselves clearly desired it, for it was they who ordered their favored champions to hunt it down. And of course, it was belakor they sent to crown the one who would wield it. The chosen was Archaon, the ever-chosen, a name that even in Immaterium carried weight. Archaon had risen far in the gods' esteem, striding through the mortal realms as their favorite avatar, his campaigns drenched in victory. Belakor's role was to lead him to the relic, to see it placed upon his brow, and thus tighten the gods' grip over their greatest servant. But belakor had other plans. He had long despised Archaon, the mortal who had stolen the title of Ever-Chosen, who walked unbound where belakor could only crawl under divine command. Here, at last, was an opportunity to end him, or at the very least, to weaken him beyond repair. If the crown was indeed a relic of Malice, then perhaps it could be turned against the four, and in the ensuing chaos, belakor might slip his chains entirely. The campaign began in shadow. The realm that held the crown was a twisted shard of reality, a place where the warp and the mortal plane had bled together in an eternal storm. Land masses drifted like ships across a black sea, colliding and shattering under constant tempests. The sky boiled with lightning that struck not where it was needed, but where it was hated. It was a battlefield shaped to break armies before they even drew steel. Belakor moved his forces in silence. Legions of shadow demons, mortal cultists sworn to him and him alone, and a cadre of lesser princes bound by debts they dared not betray. His plan was simple in theory: arrive before Archaon, take the crown, and vanish into the labyrinth of the warp before the gods realized what he had done. But the gods are never blind for long. Even as Belakor's shadow armies closed on the relic's resting place, the skies tore apart, and Archaon descended with the full might of the Ever-Chosen's host. Chaos warriors in blackened plate, beastmen by the thousand, demonic allies gifted by the four themselves. An entire crusade built not just to seize the crown, but to crush any who dare to covet it. What followed was less a battle, and more a storm-given form. The two forces collided in the shifting wastes, the ground itself betraying those who trod upon it, cracking into chasms, erupting into gouts of warp flame, shifting underfoot like the surface of a living beast. Belakor's demons fought like living shadows, melting into darkness to reappear behind enemy lines, cutting down champions before fading again. Archaon's warriors answered with unbreakable discipline, their shields and blades forged in the furnaces of gods who demanded victory. But the true duel was not between armies. It was between the first damned and the ever-chosen. They met amid the wreckage of a fallen island. The sky above them split with lightning that cast their shadows across 1,000 shifting plains. Archaon's voice was the roar of a conqueror certain of his place in destiny. Belakor's was the hiss of a predator who has waited too long to strike. Blow for blow, they fought. Belakor's blade a flicker of void light, Archaon's demon-forged weapon burning with the fury of the gods. Each strike was met, each feint countered. Archaon's strength was monstrous, but belakor's form was made of nightmare, his movements bending around the laws of physics themselves. Still, the gods had not sent their favored champion to lose. With every moment, belakor felt the unseen weight of their will pressing against him, slowing his strikes, twisting the field to Archaon's favor. The crown was close. He could see its black form resting atop a spire of bone, but the leash pulled tighter with every step. In the end, the battle turned. Not because Archaon outmatched him, though he was formidable, but because the gods willed it so. A surge of raw warp energy slammed into belakor, hurling him back into the shadow storm. His demons faltered, their essence unraveling under divine command. And in that moment, Archaon claimed the crown. Whether it was truly a relic of Malice or simply another chain forged by the Four, belakor never learned. What he did learn was this: the gods would not allow him to claim any power they had not given him. Even a weapon that might have served their cause was denied to him if it meant loosening his leash. He vanished from the battlefield before the final horn was sounded, melting into the depths of the warp with what forces he could save. To the mortal chroniclers, it would seem as though the first damned had simply failed. But in the silence of the warp, belakor turned that failure over in his mind like a whetstone on a blade. The battle for Malice had taught him something precious. If he was ever to break free, he would have to do more than seize a crown. He would have to make the gods blind. Until then, the leash would hold. But one day, perhaps, they would tug and find their shadow gone. There are places in the warp where no god's gaze lingers for long. They are not sanctuaries. Nothing in Immaterium can truly be called safe, but they are quieter. Here, the storms are slower, the howls of the damned are faint, and the tides of unreality drift without the endless hands of divine will stirring them. It is in such a place that belakor retreats when he wishes to think or to remember. There is no throne here, no war banners, no fawning court of lesser demons. Just darkness and the faint shimmer of the warp's endless sea. He walks alone along an impossible path that stretches into nothing, his talons clicking on glassy stone that was never born and will never die. His wings fold tight, his eyes fixed on a horizon where the black meets the black. And he speaks, not to anyone in particular, not to the gods, never to them, but to the void itself, as if somewhere, somehow, the galaxy might be listening. They call me first damned, he says, his voice a low growl, as though the words themselves weigh more than they should. They think an insult. They think it means I was the first fool to kneel, the first to drink from the poisoned cup. Perhaps they are right, but they forget what else it means. I was the first they feared. He pauses, his reflection flickering on the glassy path below like a shadow in oil. They speak of my chains as if they are my prison. They are not. They are my reminder. Every link, every weight, every pull upon my soul, it is proof that they fear what I might do if I were free. In these moments, there is no audience but himself. Yet his words drip with the venom of someone who has practiced them for centuries. They are a speech sharpened on repetition, honed for the day when the gods themselves will be forced to listen. I have crowned their champions. I have bowed to mortals who will be forgotten before my shadow fades. I have placed on their brows the symbols of power they thought were their own, and all the while I have smiled. I have whispered the blessings they demanded. I have given them the victories they craved. His lip curls into something between a snarl and a smile. But do they know? Do they understand? Every crown I place as a seed. Every victory I grant as a knife I plant in the soil, waiting to grow. The path beneath him shifts, the black glass cracking into threads of pale light that spiral into the abyss. Faces flicker there. Archaon, Abaddon, nameless ever-chosens, all crowned by his hand. One by one, their faces crack, shatter, and sink back into the void. They think me a servant. They think me a herald. They think me predictable. But a puppet master need not pull every string to own the stage. Sometimes, all it takes is a single thread, cut at the right moment, to bring the whole show down. His wings spread now, the shadows around him thickening, coiling like serpents. His eyes gleam with a light that is not the gods, a light of his own making. I am not their slave. I am their investment gone sour. I am the bargain they wish they had not made. And when the reckoning comes, it will not be with fire and armies. It will come with silence. A silence where their commands vanish unanswered. A silence where they call my name and hear nothing. The vision around him begins to change. The Black Sea becomes a vast battlefield, empty save for 4 thrones at its far edge, vast, monstrous things, each carved in the image of its god. They sit empty, broken. Shadows coil around them, not as prisoners, but as conquerors. I will not break my chains with rage. I will unmake them with patience. I will wait until their eyes are turned elsewhere, until they are deafened by their own wars and drunk on their own games. And then I will take everything they denied me. The battlefield fades, and once again he is walking alone, the glass path stretching into nothing. But his smile remains, faint and dangerous. Let them call me First Damned. They forget how many firsts I have yet to be. And in the quiet, his voice lowers to a whisper that is almost a promise. I will be the first to make gods bleed. In the 41st millennium, belakor is still there, still watching, still weaving his endless game. The galaxy has burned 1,000 times since his mortal days. Empires have risen and fallen into dust. But the First Damned endures, unchanged in form, but not in spirit. Every century has sharpened him. Every humiliation has taught him. Every failure has been a lesson in how to make the next wound cut deeper. To the mortals of the Immaterium, his name is barely a whisper, buried beneath layers of myth and forbidden record. Most have never heard of him, and those who think him a phantom from the time before the Emperor's rule, a story told by heretics to frighten children. That suits him well. The less they speak of him, the easier it is to move unseen. In the courts of the warp, however, his name is never truly silent. Among the demon princes, his presence is a shadow that falls long before he arrives. To some, he is an object of grudging respect, proof that even under the leash of the gods, a will can survive untamed. To others, he is a warning, the gods' punishment made flesh, the cautionary tale of what happens when ambition rises higher than the divine hand allows. But to all, he is dangerous. He is seen in wars that matter, and sometimes in wars that seem beneath him, always for a reason known only to him. In the mortal realms, he appears like a nightmare-given form, a vast winged shadow descending from storm-racked skies, his eyes glowing with the promise of doom. In the warp, he is more insidious, moving between courts, whispering into the ears of princes, turning alliances into vendettas. He can be the ally who saves you from destruction one year, and the enemy who engineers your downfall the next. The gods still send him to crown their chosen. The ritual is the same as it has been for millennia. The descent, the kneeling champion, the placing of the crown. And every time, belakor performs it flawlessly. The gods see a loyal servant fulfilling his role. The champion sees a divine herald. Only belakor knows that every coronation is another knot in a web they cannot yet see. He cannot die, not in the mortal sense. Even if struck down, his essence reforms in the warp, drawn back into the god's domain like a tide returning to the shore. That is his curse. That is also his advantage. Every return is a chance to change something, however small, in the eternal game. There are scholars, heretical, mad, or both, who claim that belakor's curse is the purest metaphor for all who serve chaos. Endless ambition, Endless torment, never satisfaction. The gods raise you up not to reward you, but to better enjoy the moment when you fall. To be a champion of chaos is to be both master and slave, conqueror and pawn. Belakor's tragedy is simply the most perfect version of the truth they all share. And yet there are signs, faint but growing, that he is closer now than ever before to slipping the leash. Whispers speak of cults in the mortal realms that serve not Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, or Slaanesh, but the Shadow Ground himself. Armies gathering in places where the gods' gaze is weakest. Artifacts long thought lost. Blades of impossible sharpness. Tomes bound in the skin of extinct species. Relics that hum with the energy of predivine chaos. Disappearing from vaults guarded by both mortal and demonic wardens. None know where they have gone. Belakor does. And perhaps the most dangerous rumor of all, that he has begun to speak of Malice again. The renegade god the four pretend does not exist. Whether Malice is real or simply a masked Belakor wears to disguise his own growing power is unknown. But in a galaxy where even a whisper can shape destiny, the very idea is enough to cause unease in the divine courts. Still, he is careful. The gods cannot yet see the whole of his plan. He crowns their champions, fights their wars, bends when they pull the chain. He plays the dutiful servant so perfectly that even the most paranoid of their number sees nothing more than the usual flicker of rebellion in him. But behind that mask, his hatred is a blade being honed to a single perfect edge. Will he ever truly be free? That is the question no one can answer, not even Belakor himself. He knows the scale of the challenge. He knows that the gods are eternal, vast beyond comprehension, and that to rise against him is to pit a drop of shadow against the ocean. But he also knows that oceans can be poisoned, that storms can be stolen from their course, and that even gods can fall if their throne is undermined long enough. And so he waits, watches, weaves. Every war he fights, every crown he places, every rival he aids or destroys, each one is another thread in a tapestry only he can see. One day, when the pattern is complete, when the gods are looking elsewhere and the galaxy is distracted by its own madness, the first dam will pull the final thread. Until then, he remains what has always been, the eternal outcast, the prince without a throne, the shadow in every victory, the whisper in every oath, the hand on every crown. If you look closely at the great tragedies of history, in the fall of empires, in the betrayal of champions, and the sudden, inexplicable collapse of wars that should have been won, you might glimpse the faint outline of wings in the darkness. You might see a shadow standing just behind the victor, its eyes gleaming with a knowledge the gods themselves pretend not to notice. And if you listen very closely, you might hear a voice, calm, patient, inevitable. One day, the crown will be mine.